behaviors are changing. Thank you very much, Mr. Bricard. Now, we're going to listen to another speaker. We'll listen to a historian, that is Florent Quellier, who is a lecturer and researcher at the CNRS at the Francois Rabelais University in the town of Tours. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Foundation Bonduelle for inviting me, and I'm a historian and will try and share the history of pulses. This is a long history, and I will focus on the Western world because we don't have enough time. I'm a historian of food and food cultures, so I'll continue and follow on and build on what Mr. Bricard has said before. I'll be talking about representations that people have. The title of my presentation is The History of Pulses in the West, the Stories and History. Stories, because the historians have focused mainly on grains and animal byproducts, but not the pulses, and the history with a capital H, because pulses have played an essential role in the evolution of humankind and the great civilizations. There's always the use and consumption of pulses. I'll start with a story. You'll tell me if it's a story or history. And this is a painting from the 17th century that is kept at the Fine Arts Museum in the town of Orleans in France. And this is something that comes from Genesis, which is an episode about Esau and Jacob. Esau gave his birthright against lentils. Now, if we analyze what's on the painting, what you will see is that on this painting we have the two characters. Socially speaking, as you see, there's a huge gap between a wealthy person who has the birthright. Esau, for instance, look at how he's dressed. And he's a hunter as well. That was a right given to him by birth. He has a dog as well to go hunting, whereas Esau has a torn shirt and is preparing a pot of lentils. As you can see, we can see the pot with lentils, which is close to another plate that has been thrown down onto the floor by a cat that's very hungry. As you see, there's a link between the animal, the cat, and the lentils here. This is a view that is negative, a negative view on the pulses. On the right-hand side, close to Esau, we have a table that is laid with a white napkin, with bread, with yeast for the elite and the wealthy people. Therefore, there's an opposition between two dietary systems, and that is easier to see on the painting. Esau is looking at the bowl of lentils and is also looking down at the cat, and therefore there's a link between Esau and the very hungry cat. Conversely, when we look at Jacob, Jacob's position is a position close to the table that was laid before. Therefore, two different types of attitudes. Then if we look at Esau, you will see that he is standing close to the plate where the food was for the dog. But the dog has not yet been fed. The dog is waiting for food. The dog has been educated and tamed, if I can say it, contrarily to the cat. Therefore, another difference between a well-tamed dog and almost a wild type of cat that is very hungry. And then, if we look at Jacob again, as you will see, he is seated and is almost like a scales. On the left, we have a plate that shows, that's in an upper position, that shows lightness of lentils as a diet. On his right-hand side, in his hand, as you can see, there's the heaviness connected to birthright. And here, Esau is giving his birthright to have a plate of lentils. I wanted to describe this as an introduction because I think there are two lessons we can derive about pulses. First, we know that pulses were eaten really in the past, and we have traces of pulses that were eaten in the Bible, and when farming started, more legumes were grown as well as grains. And that's when human beings understood how very important pulses were and leguminous diets. This plate of lentils is considered as something that's vile, which is not worthy of a higher social position. Therefore, this painting is very much connected to a Western approach that'll very much despise pulse diets, whereas most people at the time would eat these pulses for different reasons that we can see here on this other painting, which is probably the most famous representation of someone who eats beans. This is The Bean Eater by Annibale Carracci, dating to the end of the 16th century, where you have someone who is rather poor, as you can see on his face, who's eating a bowl of beans. Black-eyed beans, as you can see here. This person is very much afraid of not having enough to eat, and yet he's enjoying the food he's eating. This is how important pulses were at the time. Our society was afraid of hunger. Hunger was something very important during the Middle Ages, as well as famine. There were major famines in the past, and pulses were eaten against famine. At the time, society was very much afraid of not having enough to eat. The main advantage in eating leguminous food is that you can keep them, and as dry food, you can store them away and therefore eat them throughout the year and wait for the next crop. In French, we use an expression that says la fin des haricots. That is, that's when you run out of your dry food. That's when you are very much afraid of famine. The other advantage of pulses or legumes is that they're rather easy to prepare and keep. They're easy to keep. You can carry them around with you or on you. And thanks to pulses, you can also thicken a stew so that it is more hearty. You can look for the hearty side of your diet, which is quite comforting and reassuring at the time. And these dry pulses can be used for the baking of bread, so that you would feel good when you eat your bread and you will feel you've eaten enough. This is when pulses were seen as something essential to fight against hunger for centuries and centuries, which is what you can see here. If you look at the window here, there's a window frame, and for the historians, the idea of Fernand Braudel, a historian, is that of a long-term food prison. It's like bars on the windows. This is very much connected to dietary habits that were constrained due to technical reasons and also habits. From one generation to the next generation, people were used to eating the same type of food because the economic system at the time was such that there was no other choice. This is long-term dietary prison. This was the case for legumes and pulses. Therefore, they were usually connected to the idea of poverty. Dry legumes and pulses were usually connected to hunger and poverty and something that was rough or archaic or from the countryside. As you can see here on the painting, we have also a loaf of bread. The man, as you can see, has his hand on a chunk of bread, and there's also a link between grains or cereals and pulses, which is a classic connection. Think about America with beans and maize, or China, for instance, the link between rice and soya, or the Arab or Muslim link between chickpea and wheat, sorry. This is a connection that existed in the West. The historians will talk about the wheat civilization, but they never talk about the pulse civilization. Yet, pulse is as important as wheat, except that usually pulse is not connected to the idea of Christ. Therefore, the pulse diets were not seen as something positive, yet many people were eating them. We can say more about pulses, and we could say that these types of diets were usually connected to something that was negative in the medical discourse. Well, I'll start with this book that was written in the 18th century, and this book is interesting in as much as it recaps the knowledge, the dietary and medical knowledge that existed at the time from the antique times and medieval period, thanks to which we have a good idea as to how the elite were looking at pulses at the time. Here's an example. Faba beans. For Fabaceae, well, they're seen as food that has many defects, and they lead to the fact that people were farting. That was a problem for the elite at the time. In a civilization process that developed in the 13th century in the West, and that still continues today, the objective is to have a distance, to take distance when it's too close to something that's connected to animals, and all the sounds connected to digestion as well, like farting, which was not correct for the elite. But for the general population, during the Middle Ages, or at other moments in time, well, farting was not a problem. It was rather reassuring. It really showed that your body was working well, and that you were living well, and that you'd eaten enough. But for the elite, on the contrary, the objective was not to do this. And farting was therefore something that gave a bad image to pulses and legumes in the West. Digestion is difficult because this is dry food, and the drier it is, the more difficult it was to digest, is what people thought at the time. And people thought that pulses were therefore cursed with a dimension that was too much connected to the earth. So difficult things to digest if you had a delicate stomach. In the Middle Ages and during the old regime, people were convinced about the fact that you were born with a given type of stomach. If you were a farmer, then your stomach would be more solid and could take a food intake that was rather rough. Whereas if you were born within the elite, nobility, or the bourgeoisie, you were born with a delicate stomach, and therefore you could only eat good food, and you wouldn't be in a position to digest these rough pulses. We could say the same about beans as well. What's interesting about beans is that these beans were coming from the Americas. They were not known in the West before the 16th century. And then people started to eat beans in the West because these again were pulses that could be kept as dry food and therefore were used to fight against hunger. As you can see here, facilis or beans were therefore used as other types of pulses, but connected to negative things, like farting again, too heavy for the stomach, too heavy for the head as well. And therefore this is connected to Brillat-Savarin, who said, "Tell me what you're eating, I'll tell you who you are." The idea is that our diet would have an impact on our behaviors. Think about the French expression, which is petzouille, that appeared in the 19th century. This means a bean eater, but a French petzouille is someone who is not refined enough, someone who doesn't know much about urban style. So there's a link between what people eat and how they behave. There's another dimension that will lead to, again, a negative image connected to pulses, apart from the fact that people who would eat this diet would be considered as being poor, is that this was connected to the moment of Lent, moment of the year called Lent. Most Western diets were based on meat and meat first. When the church wanted people to stop eating during Lent, the church said that meat should not be eaten, to even strengthen the social position of meat at the time. And the dry legumes were very much connected to this. Historically speaking, with the first religious groups that banned the eating of animal byproducts, well, they said that people daily should also eat chickpea soups or faba bean soups. So it's based on the negative image again. And this is something that happened during the 40 days of Lent, of penance, when people would mainly eat dry food and legumes. This was presented by the previous speaker who talked about the sun-based agriculture or farming, when in April and March people would eat mainly dry food, dry vegetable. So this means that pulses were also connected to the food penance and would eat chickpea stew. During the medieval period and old regime, there were two types of diets, one that was fat and the other one that was meager or light, with the use of chickpea puree, another way of preparing leguminous food to prepare the food that was considered as being light food, instead of having stews and other types of heavier food. So here again it's connected to the idea of penance, food or dietary penance. On the Friday, people wanted to have a stew that was as light as possible and as close as possible to water. However, pulses were eaten by the elite and gained a positive image in some rare cases if these were eaten as dairy produce. Leguminous food or legumes were not just eaten when they were dry, and this happened as early as the Middle Ages. People had this taste for dairy produce or fresh faba beans. I was thinking, for instance, about a book that was written at the end of the 14th century, where there's recipes and there's a gardening treaty in this book that explains that the objective was to try and have dairy produce with fresh faba beans for the well-off, that is aristocracy, or the equivalent of upper middle class at the time. And in the 16th and 17th century, we saw that there was a social difference between people, those who could afford these fresh beans. Les délices de la campagne is a book written in the 17th century that says that what's very important is to have fresh food. So there's a social difference here based on dietary consumption or food consumption. You could show you belong to the elite because you were not worried about supplies of food, but also you could really have dairy produce and fresh beans, whereas the majority of people would eat them as dry beans. This is the difference between the two social groups. The fresh beans were easier to digest. Look at what we have on the right-hand side, a letter from Madame de Maintenon, where she talks about indigestions connected to peas eaten by the court in Versailles. This is not an anecdote. This is a dietary culture that's based on the consumption of fresh peas for some groups to differentiate from the people, the plebe. What was very important was to remember that the 17th century was a century when the weather conditions were colder, and therefore, technically speaking, that was even more difficult to obtain fresh beans. And as you know, in the 17th century, the elite were trying to domesticate nature, which is what we saw here with the fresh beans and also with the green beans, which is the French innovation, or French beans. The objective was to keep also pods that were not yet mature, to show that you were belonging to the aristocracy. The French beans, or green beans, were those eaten at the 17th and 18th century by the French aristocracy. This was a different dietary system that was connected to dairy produce and the delicacy of plants, even though these are pulses. So you see, the codes changed at the time. And more importantly, these fresh dairy beans were connected or used with grease and butter, typical of French food, and also meat and peas, green peas. So, pulses or dry pulses were usually connected to what was eaten by the poor, the equivalent of meat for the poor. And in the West, then, things changed, but very slowly. There was a link between the food or the meat for the poor and the type of diet that people would want to eat. This is when things changed. People decided to eat dry beans because they looked down on meat, and this is to be found in treatises in the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. In these books, the writers said that it was a mistake to try and eat meat at every single meal, and that this could lead to a number of pathologies. In fact, these books were for the popular classes, the lower classes. Their concerns were that of dietary hygiene, but also there was an economic objective, which was to overcome the fact that people couldn't eat meat. So here again, meat for the poor. Those who were writing these types of books were not, of course, eating the same type of food, which is obvious. And in these books, the suggestion is to therefore eat legumes and pulses. This was the discourse at the time. The discourse was that you could have plant-based proteins to replace meat. But here again, this is working class circles or lower class circles, people who couldn't afford to eat meat. Again, meat for the poor by default. This type of diet changed then when the veggie ideal developed in the West. This is a rebirth of veggie ideal that started in the 19th century. It started in the English-speaking world to start with, that is England and North America. It started in 1847 with the first vegetarian society that was set up 30 years before a similar society was set up in France, which really shows that this was an English world type of development, English-speaking world development. And as you can see here, this is a totally different type of choice. This discourse was developed on the basis of a vegetarian society. Pulses and legumes were here to replace meat, which is what you could see. This is a PhD thesis that was presented in Paris in 1880. This is the vegetarian ideal, which in the 20th century further developed.
This is a study which was carried out by the Greek authorities on the so-called Cretan regime. Immediately after World War II, epidemiologists compared the Cretan regime, which is based very much on the concept of shortage. So we are in a period of shortage. This is not traditional. It is linked to the shortage of that time. And we're benchmarking that regime to the regime of in the US with excessive consumption of meat, emerging obesity, cardiovascular pathologies. And then in the 1990s, there has been a more assertive discourse, again, around the so-called Mediterranean regime, or again, the Cretan regime, which contains many pulses. And later, this is backed up by the development of the emergence of ecology, which condemns the consumption of meat for both public health reasons, but also environmental reasons, the pollution of water tables, deforestation, and all of a sudden there seems to be awareness about the fact that pulses may be an alternative. Now, looking at culture now, food habits and food culture in Latin Europe, well, what we are seeing there again is that there is a wish to come back to more authentic cooking, authentic food, with a focus on both responsible food but also pleasure food, locally grown vegetables, and pulses, of course. This movement has very much served the cause of pulses with, once again, more responsible food, both for well-off urban citizens who are quite environmentally conscious and health conscious. Initially, this food was seen as archaic, old-fashioned, and this negative image was turned into an advantage, into something positive, by insisting on the fact that they're locally grown. For example, here is the example of the so-called Paimpol Coucou, 1998. They've only been grown since 1928, so it's really not that authentic. But a lot of it is in the imagination, and all this explains why the way people look at pulses changes in the Western world. Now, here is what the Food Organization has said about pulses. Once again, the stake is now quite clear. The food supply is at stake. And there is the environmental question with the nitrogen fixation in which is something which has been quite known, not necessarily understood, but known for hundreds of years. So this is what the World Food Organization has communicated about, and little by little it seems that now a better understanding and greater focus is also given to pulses and the role of pulses in humanity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup. Merci Florent Quellier pour ce nouveau, ce regard.
Thank you very much indeed for this history lesson about pulses. Unfortunately, the question is asked off mic. Did you hear the question? What is the role of pulses? What role have pulses played in Africa? Well, historically, it's there's always been a combination between cereal and pulses. There are several pulses that were found in the Middle Ages in Europe. Certain beans, medieval beans, that are today quite widespread in Africa. I must say that I haven't really developed my research on Africa. I am an expert on Western Europe. That is the reason. But again, there is the combination of cereal and pulses is quite widespread around the planet. Is not something that has been the case in or a practice in Europe only. Once again, I am afraid, but the question is asked off mic. Answer. Well, the World Food Organization has clearly said that pulses are a source of protein, and there are other sources of protein, such as insects, for example, which is also an emerging trend. Okay, questions? More questions? Good morning. I'm a doctor. I am a member of Mensa organization, which is an organization which was created in Oxford. You were talking about the elite, and it seems that we've done we do a lot of work with IQ. You may have heard about obviously the Asperger syndrome.
C'est une réalité pour eux dont il faut tenir compte. Et donc, effectivement, ce que vous disiez comme un principe, non, c'est une réalité biologique.
I think there is a physiological and biological difference between certain people. Well, between in the Middle Ages and the old regime, we consider that nobles. That it was linked to the blood. But you can't just claim that certain people, certain classes, have more than others. Sorry, we're still getting questions that are being asked off mic. Unfortunately, the interpreter cannot hear. My point is, during the old regime, the rationale was done by social category, by social group. Okay, can we take maybe one final question? We are getting a bit short on time. Please. My name is Daniel Duret. I'm a nutritionist and food sociologist. Thank you very much for your presentation. You made a distinction between cereal and dry pulses or legumes. Wheat can be fermented, especially with technology which is, technology which is used for processing the wheat. The bubbles of air in the fermentation is quite symbolic. Air moving up in the air, which has a very symbolic is a very symbolic message. Elevation, as in the elevation of social elevation, versus the non-elevation of in the fermentation of pulses. You're absolutely right. Of course, there is all this imaginary around white bread, processed flour, white bread. And you're absolutely right. Light bread in the Western world, white bread is fresh bread. As opposed to dry bread, stale bread, which calls for a different type of mastication in order to feel filled, get a sense of being filled. The richer people don't have that concern. Don't have that need to feel filled. So again, the role of pulses is very important to understand the imaginary. Both are important. But again, cereal have become more noble, and that has not at all been the case of pulses. Right, and today we're seeing again that people tend to eat less white bread, more whole bread, darker bread. Again, thank you very much, Florent Quellier. We're going to move on now to the next presentation.